Hi everyone, my name is Jen Sookfong Lee and welcome to my event called From Ideas to Finished Book, A Writing Life. I am recording this from my home, from my bedroom, which is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations, and I am here in partnership with the Wandafeuka branch of the Greater Victoria Library, which acknowledges the Lekwungen people and the traditional territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. I am a settler here and so very grateful to be able to live, work, and create on these lands. I write a lot about migration and diversity, and I'm acutely aware of where we are and what we owe to Indigenous communities. I also want to acknowledge the generous support of the Greater Victoria Public Library and the IslandLink Library Federation for funding this video. Thank you for bringing writers and readers together as great libraries do so well. So what I thought would be fun is if I told you about the evolution of my writing life through talking about how I got ideas for my books and then how they actually became a real book, because that happens sometimes. Sometimes we get an idea and sometimes it becomes a real book. So we're going to start at the very beginning with The End of East, which is my first novel. And it came out in 2007, which feels like a lifetime ago, but isn't quite yet. This is what it looks like. This is my very battered reading copy. I've not changed my reading copy in all these years since 2007, so that's why it looks a little worse for wear. It's traveled everywhere with me. So The End of East, I started writing it when I left school. I was about 22, 23 years old, and I had just moved into my first sort of real adult apartment, and I had a little space for my office. And on the wall above my writing desk, I had hung a copy of my grandfather's head tax certificate. If you're not familiar with the head tax and the Chinese Exclusion Act, the head tax was a fee essentially imposed on Chinese immigrants, only Chinese immigrants, who were coming to Canada, I think between the years of 1886 and 1923. You are welcome to Google and check my dates on that. And it ranged in price from $50 to $500, which at the peak, it was equivalent to something like 2 years of salary. And they were forced, basically Chinese immigrants, who were mostly men at the time, to pay this tax if they wanted to enter Canada. And then in 1923, the Chinese Exclusion Act became law, which prohibited Chinese immigrants from coming at all. And the effect of these policies is that families were kept apart for many years, husbands and wives, fathers and sons, and that, particularly for my grandfather, who came in 1918, he actually lived alone without his family in Vancouver for 39 years, except for brief visits home, which is when he and my grandmother conceived my dad and my aunties, which is a fact I wish I didn't know, but it's true. It had the effect of sort of intergenerational sort of isolation and trauma. And in The End of East is something I write about quite a lot. So at that time, when I started writing it, I had that head tax certificate on the wall above my desk. I also started a new job, and the office was actually in Chinatown. And I hadn't really spent much time in Chinatown since I was a kid, when I used to go shopping with my mom. And I found myself sort of walking down the same sidewalks that my grandfather had walked down and touching the same, brick facades on those really old buildings, much like Victoria's Chinatown. It had a really similar vibe in terms of like architecture and age. And I also even walked past the site of my grandfather's barbershop, which is on the corner of Main and Pender, if anybody ever wants to check that out. It's an herbalist shop now. They sell lots of really nice tea. It occurred to me that I didn't know anything about my grandfather's life. He was 80 when I was born, and he died when I was 13, so I didn't get a chance to ask him those questions that I would have had he been alive when I was an adult. So I started writing this long poem and reimagining what I thought his life could have been in those years that he was alone in Canada. And it became a very, very long poem. And at some point, I decided that it was going to be a novel. I was very young and I had a lot of youthful optimism. Keep in mind, I had not really written fiction in any serious way up until this point. So I really didn't know what I was getting into, and it took me 7 years to write. But The End of East became not just about a fictionalized version of my grandfather, but it also encompassed, 4 other protagonists, which were, 3 different generations of one family. It became the end of East. So here it is. I'm going to read a little bit to you from near the beginning when Said Kwan is arriving in Canada for the first time, and he's my kind of fictional stand-in for my grandfather. Arrival. Said Kwan knows he is dirty. He can smell the boat on his skin, the salty, rancid odor of cured fish, other men's hair oils, rotting wood. It is windy, and the water is nothingness, gray, bottomless, incomprehensible. The roof of his mouth is crackling dry, and his hands shake as he smooths down the front of his only jacket. He wants his mother. Only one thought runs through his head. I cannot imagine that this will be all right. He looks out toward the city and sees the mountains, dark blue and hazy behind the wood-frame buildings, which appear dirty and brown, larger manifestations of the smell on his skin. He fears that the stink will be mistaken for the smell of China, but he does not know how to say that there would be no smell if Canada never was, if the boats were not so full of desperation, men trading one kind of poverty for another. Mud pools around the wooden sidewalks, indistinguishable from horse dung or something worse. He hears the water crashing, changing shape as it hits the shore and the wooden docks. He wonders if the ocean, so close, so savage, will consume him and sweep everything else away. He shifts his small bag from one hand to the other. He does not know where to start, which lineup he needs to be in, which direction to walk in to find the part of the city where all the Chinamen live. He had hoped someone would be able to guide him, but when he was on the boat, while they were talking and eating their watery soup and salt-cured fatty pork, he found that everyone knew as little as he did. Like him, they had read the letters that other men from their villages sent home describing the beautiful land, the generosity of the white men, the fortunes they were making. And like him, they saw how much richer those men's wives and children became. The first afternoon at sea, an older man shuffled past him on the deck, his thin hips only partially hidden by his oversized Western-style pants. He turned to Said Kwan and looked him from head to shoes. You must be new. Said Kwan nodded. I'm going to stop there. Said Kwan's arrival in Vancouver. One of the very first passages I ever wrote, and I think it's remained mostly unchanged over all these years. So we're going to move on to my next novel, The Better Mother, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I started writing that. Again, a very battered reading copy, the only one I've ever used. This book was published in 2011, and what happened with The Better Mother was that I had gone to an exhibit at the Vancouver Art Gallery, and they were showing the photographs of a photographer named Theodore Wan. And he took these kind of staged satires of like medical photographs, like surgical photographs. But what he also did, there was a small little glass case with these headshots that he used to do for exotic dancers, Vancouver being, of course, a place where there were a lot of exotic dancers, especially in the 20th century, latter half of it. And it was what he did for money, which I thought was really interesting, because as a photographer, you'd think, what were the things you would do to make money? Maybe weddings, maybe like babies or school photos, but he took photos of exotic dancers instead. And it got me thinking about why he would choose to do that. Theodore Wan eventually died in 1987 in his 30s, quite a young death. I actually don't know the cause of his death, but it got me thinking about the deaths of young men in the 1980s, which were the result of HIV/AIDS and the crisis that was sort of ripping its way through the gay male community, particularly in Vancouver. And in my head, I thought that these two things were sort of connected. This is the way novels work. You have all these different ideas, and in your head somehow they're connected. And then I started thinking about sort of burlesque and striptease, and how in Vancouver's Chinatown, back in the day, in the sort of like mid-20th century, there were a lot of those sorts of cabarets, and Chinatown, of course, in those days was kind of a bachelor neighborhood, mostly made up of men who were here without their wives. And I just started thinking there's a novel in there somewhere about when burlesque and Chinatown collides, and then who how do those relationships change people, and who do they end up becoming? So that was the idea for The Better Mother, and I came up with two different characters, Danny, who is sort of loosely inspired by Theodore Wan, and Miss Val, who is a burlesque dancer. And they initially meet when Danny is a child, and then they don't meet again for like another 28 years. And then when Miss Val is older, like she's retired, and Danny is in his 30s and a photographer, they meet again, and their friendship revives itself. So that's The Better Mother. So I'm going to read you a little bit on the beginning when Danny and Val first meet. And The Better Mother, I should say, for me, is a story about coming to terms with identity, especially if that identity is still unnamed, if you come from a community that remains mostly invisible to the mainstream. And I think, Danny and Val were both misfits. They desperately wanted to fit in, but neither of them ever could. So we're going to start from the very beginning. I'm just going to read you a little bit. This is from the prologue, and the year is 1958. Danny is 8 years old and skinny, a boy who fingers his kneecaps every night, wondering if the sharp bones will pierce through his skin if he gets any taller. It's summertime, and his black hair, thick and straight and glued in place with 3 generous dollops of Brill cream, shines in the sunlight as he bobs and darts through late afternoon crowds on Pender Street. A white woman in a grayish-pink straw hat, the color Danny imagines is called Dusty Rose, stops to stare, her green eyes lingering over his cut-off jean shorts. He tugs at his almost outgrown striped t-shirt, but soon recovers. It's not he who should feel out of place, but this knobbly-faced woman. She is, he thinks, the kind of person his father complains about, the kind who comes down to Chinatown on weekends and holidays to gawk at the mysterious dried seahorses in the herbalist's window, taking in the stacks of Chinese newspapers on the street corners, the lined and tanned men leaning against the buildings, their fingernails yellow and split from cigarettes and weekday work. Danny grins sweetly at this woman until she tentatively smiles back. She isn't to blame for being one of the many tourists who troop through the neighborhood and hog all the parking spots big enough to fit his parents' boat of a car. Satisfied, he continues weaving between people until he spies his father's favorite cafe. Standing at the counter inside, he can see, behind glass, the rows and rows of apple tarts, their flaky tops sprinkled with sugar. But he knows that looking isn't any use. Money, it seems, is always tight, and the family's curio shop always on the verge of closing. Besides, he had lunch at home with his mother and little sister just 4 hours ago. A bowl of bland but filling rice, that leafy green he can never remember the name of. A steamed pork patty dotted with a pickled snow cabbage he hates. I'm going to stop there. Eventually, if you want to read The Better Mother, Danny and Miss Val meet in an alley in Chinatown while she's on a break from her burlesque dancing schedule. Her stage name is actually the Siamese Kitten, which I made up, and I was like really impressed with myself with that stage name. I thought it was so funny. Because the interesting thing about Miss Val is that she puts on yellowface, essentially. She dances as what she would call an Oriental princess, but she's white. And so it was this whole layer of like identity and stuff, and I just thought the Siamese Kitten was like hilarious on so many dirty joke levels. So there you go. So my third novel was The Conjoined. It's my most recent novel from 2016. And here's the cover. We've got our inverted Little Red Riding Hoods. And sort of the genesis of this is that I had been reading a news article about a woman who had died, and her family had been cleaning out her house, as one does, and they found 2 dead bodies in her deep chest freezers that she had in the basement. Those 2 bodies turned out to be the bodies of 2 sisters that she had fostered in her home many years earlier, and who had disappeared, and people had just assumed that they had run away, and that was that, and they hadn't really ended up looking for them. And she kept them in her freezer for all these years, and the article didn't tell me how they died. It didn't say whether they suspected foul play, although how could they not? But what my brain went is, I need to write a novel about that, because I'm a bit of Looney Tunes that way. I read disturbing things, and I think I should write about them. I wanted to write a novel about sort of at-risk girls and women who live or work or have their lives in the downtown east side in Vancouver, which is commonly called the poorest postal code in all of Canada. And I really wanted these girls to be Chinese Canadian in the novel because I think I was actively pushing against this model minority narrative, or this myth that is often attributed to Chinese Canadians that, we come to Canada, we do really well, and it's like an immigration success story that makes everybody feel real good about our sort of diverse society. But like all myths, it's not entirely true. It's mostly wrong. And when I was growing up, I certainly knew a lot of families who were really struggling, who were in this like kind of cycle of working poverty because their language skills weren't good enough to finish school, or their accents were too rough for them to get hired in any like fancy jobs. So the conjoined for me was sort of pushing back against that narrative. If these girls were actually apprehended from their families and placed into foster care. And so, this is where the conjoined came from. And also, fun fact, I worked in social services for about 7 years, and 6 or 7 years. And I worked for an agency that helped support families who had adopted children, often out of foster care. And, that sort of experience of working in social services and like experiencing the fact that social services largely employs a workforce of white women, yet the families that they're helping come from everywhere and have all sorts of different backgrounds and different makeups. These women were forced to consider cultural stuff, and they either rose to the challenge or they failed. So I really wanted to write a little bit about that too, and it became The Conjoined. And my protagonist is named Jessica. She's a social worker, and that's what happens. And her and her father end up finding the bodies of two dead sisters in her recently deceased mother's deep chest freezers, just like the news story. And then Jessica goes on a journey to try to figure out what happened to them. She feels tremendous guilt, as you would expect. So what I'm going to read for you is a section sort of from the middle of the book, where I am writing sort of in the voice of Ginny, who is the two girls' mother, the two girls who eventually end up dying. And this is from 1984, and this is sort of going back in time to so we can figure out why those girls got apprehended in the first place. Here we go. When Bill and Ginny Cheng moved to Union Street, they took pictures on the front lawn. Bill and Ginny in the back, Casey and Jamie in front, their little girl shoulders narrow under their parents' hands. The grass was patchy and the porch needed to be painted, but it didn't matter. They had a yard and a basement for storage, and they didn't have to share a bathroom with anyone, not like in the attic apartment they had just left with its steep staircase and gaping windows. The girls were in school at Lord Strathcona, grades 4 and 5, and Bill had been working as a longshoreman for 6 months, saving up for a car and now the extra rent on this little blue house. Ginny was working nights at the Patricia Hotel, cleaning, filing, answering phones. Of course, if the family had had the choice, they would have chosen a newer house in one of the quieter East Vancouver neighborhoods, maybe by Hastings Park or even near Main Street, south of the cemetery. But this is what they could afford. Besides, it was close to work. The girls didn't have to change schools. McLean Park was only 2 blocks away. Ginny reasoned that the park was pretty safe, in the daytime anyway. During the week, Bill left the house by 6, and Ginny got the girls all to herself before school. She crept into the room in the mornings and watched them sleep. Casey slept by the window, her arm flung over the top of her head, mouth open. Jamie's bed was up against the wall by the closet. She curled up, knees tucked into her stomach. Their breathing was always in tandem, even when one had a cold or the other was snoring, in and out, like they didn't know any other way. Ginny blew on their ears. They woke up, stretching slowly, smiling when they heard their mother say, "Breakfast is almost ready." They ate and ate, but stayed skinny. Ginny wondered if all her girls could grow were bones and long, thick, night-black hair. Sometimes Ginny would make rice congee or steam the pork dumplings she kept in the freezer. Mostly, though, Casey and Jamie weren't interested in the kind of breakfast Ginny's own mother used to make for her in their old Chinatown rooming house. Instead, they ate toast with jam or sugary cereal. Ginny shivered as she watched them slurp up the pink-tinged milk. She could never understand why anyone would eat cold food first thing in the morning. The girls sang as they got ready for school, songs they learned in class or the pop songs they heard on the radio. "It's Karma Chameleon, James, come on, sing with me." After she dropped them off and returned home, she replayed their off-key warbling in her head to fill the empty rooms as she tidied and ironed her clothes for work. When she lay down to sleep, she could smell their musty child sweat from the tops of their heads. She wished she could dip her sheets in that smell and wrap herself up warm and drowsy. When Bill came home, she rushed through dinner and homework, bathed the girls as quickly as possible, and then left, taking small, quick steps to the hotel in the dark night. She never took the new blue Chrysler because it seemed like such a waste to drive when she could walk in 8 minutes. But she never stopped peering into the bushes beside the sidewalk or speeding up when she passed a windowless van. Things happened to women in Chinatown. The police had been asking questions at the hotel, asking if Ginny had noticed when the hooker who usually stood on the corner outside had just stopped showing up. "Why?" she asked. "Did something happen to her?" The police officer winced. "I can't really say. We found her purse and shoes, but not her." She never heard anything about it on the news, but she knew that the girl was dead. She'd come to expect it. Everyone who had to work or lived down here thought the same way. Okay, I'm going to pause there. I'm going to stop there. And that's the conjoined. So we're going to talk a little bit about my kids' books, and just for a little bit because, time is short, but here they are. They have such lovely covers I have to show. This is Chinese New Year, which is my first kids' picture book. This is The Animals of Chinese New Year, which is my little baby book. Very sweet. This baby is very squishable. And also my most recent kids' book, which came out, last month, which is Finding Home, The Journey of Immigrants and Refugees. So all of these books, Chinese New Year and Finding Home, are both nonfiction. The baby book is based on the story of the animals of the Chinese zodiac. And all of these books were an attempt by me to sort of bring a little bit of who I am into the lives of children, talking to them about, the celebration of Chinese New Year, the history of it, where it originated and how it spread all over the world, which is something that's really important to me because Chinese New Year was, or it continues to be my family's most important holiday. And with Finding Home, The Journey of Immigrants and Refugees, I was really determined to explain to kids why our cities are diverse, what pushes people to leave their home countries to find home somewhere else, partly because I think that migrants and, like refugees and, displaced persons, they're in the news a lot, and there's a lot of rhetoric, by various people about what is legal and illegal and what's a threat and what's not a threat. And it seemed to me that there was very little background for kids about what that actually means to be someone seeking asylum. And I really wanted to put a human face on the people who actually risk their lives often to try to find safety and security in another country. And I interviewed a bunch of people for Finding Home, and it was a real joy to write. These are difficult books to write because I was basically explaining sort of complex topics for middle school kids. My son is that age now. But I thought it was really important. I do really believe that there is nothing that children can't understand as long as it's explained to them in ways that are developmentally appropriate for them, and as long as you're really honest and you present them, with facts. And, fun fact, Chinese New Year, that guy is banned in China. That's a fun story. It's because that, you can't talk about the history of Chinese New Year unless you talk about the Cultural Revolution and Mao and all those many years that Chinese families in China actually didn't have the means to celebrate the New Year, like the Lunar New Year and the Spring Festival. So I talked about Mao a little bit, and I got the book banned in China, which is, I'm oddly proud of that fact. That seems cool. Seems like I'm doing what I should be doing if I'm ruffling some political feathers. So moving on, I'm going to talk a little bit about the shadow list. Again, my reading copies look so terrible. I'm sorry, but I love my books. The books I read also look like this, like the books I read for fun. Shadow List is my very first poetry collection, and it just came out like a couple of weeks ago, so it's still very new to me. And, part of the genesis for this book is that I was reading one of my favorite books, which is by Grand Central Station, I Sat Down and Wept by Elizabeth Smart, that wonderful classic. And I started thinking about how Asian female authors were very rarely given the opportunity to publish stories of like desire or show that their lives are messy, and to like show that we have other feelings other than like liking to play the piano and making dumplings with their moms. And I got to thinking, could I write something inspired by Grand Central Station? I sat down and wept, but still be the Asian lady that I am. So that was something I was really trying to do, to talk about the hidden desires and the hidden lives of women who are often confined by what the world expects of us. And like, it was a really interesting experiment for me to sort of give voice to all those ugly things, not necessarily ugly, actually, I shouldn't say that, to all of those things that we often keep hidden because our lives are very busy with our kids and our work, and all of that other stuff. So what happens to all those things that we suppress? They're going to explode somewhere. They're going to explode into a poetry collection. So I'm going to read a poem nearish the end, and it's called "For This You Need a Map." Outside, pigeons huddle under eaves too shallow for any other bird. You hear them at night, breathing into their closed wings, their collective murmur a rhythm that radiates through siding and walls. Beyond the sour cherry trees, the tankers speed toward the mountain highway, and you think about where else you might go from here. North to the cliffs, east to the valley, south to the river, west to where the action is. You've been planning escapes your whole life, spending long nights wrapped in blankets with a notebook, making lists of provisions and destinations, the phone numbers you want to take with you, studying maps of unfamiliar roads. This is what you've closed the bedroom door to hide. Your dog knows, but she hasn't revealed your secrets yet. During the day, you drink coffee, listen to the radio, walk to the dry cleaners. In the sunshine, no one can see you scanning the roads looking for a path, hidden or otherwise, out. The bridge is to the right, the cold, choppy inlet below. It's there you always turn. You imagine standing midway, leaning into the wind that blows northeast through Indian Arm to Belcara and Anmore, places you love for the ice-sharp air, for the green moss, for the nurse logs with which you silently feel a kinship. The cars driving past would drown out anything you might say, and no one would ever find anything you might drop over a barricade. A necklace, a book, that dress, bald and knotted so it falls with the right velocity, every gift, every last one. You could be lighter, a bird bone of a woman, the sort who would be carried by wind and storm, descending slowly in circles until your feet skimmed the surface and you would submerge, ankles first and head last, not sinking but soaking in salt water until you're the color of the night sky reflected in the night ocean. This is the plan. It always has been. Just under the surface, the waves obscure your face just so until there is nothing left to find. Well, I want to thank you for spending this time with me online. One day I hope to meet all of you in person. That is my pandemic wish, that I get to tour again and I get to travel to different places and meet all the people who very kindly like to read my books. And yeah, I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank the Greater Victoria Public Library and IslandLink Library Federation for bringing me here and making this possible. Yeah, thank you so much.